Hello, welcome to Knit Matters Season 4, Episode 2. Thank you for joining me. I'm delighted that you're here. I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm a fibre artist. I'm a knitting educator. I'm a Craft Yarn Council knitting instructor. I also used to be a yarn store owner in Brighton, England many years ago. And one of the joys of owning a yarn store is that you get to be able to teach people how to knit. I loved doing it then and I love doing it now. Now, in the last episode, we talked about the forethought heel when knitting socks. This episode is all about the afterthought heel. Now, like me, you may have seen patterns, videos, articles where the afterthought heel is actually really a forethought heel. And that can be confusing because both versions are done after the sock is knitted. So what's the difference? Well, with a forethought heel, you know where you want to place the heel while you're knitting it, and you usually mark that place with a placeholder of waste yarn and then go back to it once the rest of the sock is knitted. If you want to have a recap or see how that's done, go to Season 4, Episode 1, and you can find all previous episodes on our YouTube channel. Now, a true afterthought heel is when you can't determine where the heel goes while knitting it. Now that may be because you're knitting it for somebody else and you're not sure of the exact length of their foot and you need to check that later. So you can work on the sock and then put the heel in afterwards. It may be because you're using something like a self-striping yarn or particular colorwork pattern where you don't want to interrupt the pattern with the heel until you've actually finished and seen where it's going to go. So although the term afterthought heel is used interchangeably in a lot of patterns and videos and blogs, it's really not a big deal. You just need to know the difference for your particular project, okay? So the true afterthought heel is what we're doing in this episode. So I'm going to change to the worktop because before we actually get going on the afterthought heel, I had a question. I had actually more than one question about needles when you're knitting socks, and what's the best needles to use. Well, there's no best needle. It's really down to personal preference, and I have tried many options. DPNs. DPNs generally aren't my first choice, although I did like using these. These are really nice to use. They have a little kind of curved bit at the end of the needle, so your stitches actually kind of don't shoot off the needle. I used these when I was making the stripy socks that I showed you last week, or last episode I should say. I found them nice to use but way too long, and I couldn't get them in a shorter size, so I felt that I was sort of battling with longer needles that I really needed. So whilst they're not my first choice, these were actually very nice needles to use. Then, of course, there are circular needles. I do like circular needles very much. I use them a lot, even for backward and forward knitting, flat knitting. But if you're going to use circulars for socks, you'll need to use the magic loop technique. I am very comfortable with a magic loop technique, but I know that some people don't like it and don't get on with it. So if you don't like using magic loop, then these might not be your preference. My great friend and Knit Matters viewer, Pauline Smith, has told me about some needles by Addy called Sock Wonder. I don't have an example here, but essentially they're a short circular needle, very short cable on them, and one needle is actually shorter than the other. So you've got a certain amount of flexibility with using a small needle. She said that they're a little bit fiddly, but quite useful, and I'm looking forward to trying those. Lately, I'm going to put that there because I'm going to need that later. Lately, I've been using these are called Flexi Flips. These are by Addy. I really like them. You have two stitches for your needles, two needles for your stitches, I should say, and the third one you're actually knitting the live stitches. I really quite like them. As I say, these are by Addy, but I also have a set by Haya, and there may well be other brands that make them as well. but essentially they're a very short circular, but they've got this nice little sort of flexi bit in the middle, which is really helpful for sort of, you know, smaller items. Anyway, those I will be using later, so I'll show you how they work. Pop them away. Okay, so at the end of the day, it's all down to personal preference. It's all down to personal preference, what you feel physically comfortable with, and what fits your budget. Oh, one thing I should say about the flexi type needles. The only downside I think to these is they are not inexpensive. So if you're getting a special size for one project, it might not be worth it for you. It might not make any sense. If you're knitting socks a lot or smaller projects a lot, and you're using the same needle size all the time, then it might well be worth the investment. But again, all down to personal preference, what suits you and your budget. The other thing I want to say is, when you're knitting socks, do test swatch your gauge, your personal knitting tension. It is important to get the correct gauge on socks because you're knitting with negative ease. You're knitting to the exact size, as it were, because the sock needs to stretch. You don't want to end up with a big sock. And because you're knitting in the round, your tension, your gauge swatch needs to be tested in the round. So because it's different, you're only knitting knit rows, you're not doing purl rows. So the gauge, even if you have perfect gauge for the pattern on flat knitting, when you're knitting in the round, it's different. So if you want to know how to test swatch for knitting in the round, take a look at season 3, episode 9, and I show you how to do that. I will also just mention, bear with me if you heard it last time, but knit both socks using the same needles that you select. So I did an experiment with these. I ended up knitting 3 socks. I knitted one with the DPNs, and with these, and I knitted one on my circular with the magic loop technique. And when I'd done 2 socks, I noticed that my gauge was much better with the circular and the magic loop. Now it could have been, as I say, because my DPNs were a bit long. Had I used something this length, it might have been better. But anyway, I had to knit a 3rd sock, and my preferred gauge for the sock was the circular. So whatever you choose, make sure you do both socks with the same tools once you've checked your tension. Okay, now the true afterthought heel. We have, the sock is a tube. We're making a tube with a toe, and then we want to put in a heel. So obviously this is shorter than for a real sock. This is just my sample. So the toe has been done, and I'm going to do the same method for my heel. So to sort of give you an example what that would look like, my heel is going to sort of go there, and of course once it's, you know, once it becomes a heel, it's going to look more like that. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, you'll see here that I've marked the sides here on my tube. Don't worry about these needles sticking out. I'm going to show you something else as we go along, but for the moment, to prepare to place your heel in your afterthought heel, you need to know where your sides are. Now that sounds pretty obvious. You know where your sides are. You've put stitch markers in as you've been working in the round, or you've had some method of marking that. But once you take it off the needles, and this is not blocked yet, it's a different thing. It can twist, it can move around a bit. So you really need to mark your sides, and I'll show you how to do that on this other little one. What you want to do, and most sock patterns, you're using half the amount of stitches for the heel opening. So what do I mean by that? So again, this is my sample. I know I've got 40 stitches all the way round, so I'm going to be using 20 stitches for my heel opening. But I need to find my sides first. So what I need to do, and it's easier if I start from the toe, I need to find, this is where my shaping is. You can see my my SSKs here and my knit twos together. I hope you can anyway. So that's how they look when it's flat. I've just opened that out. So what I have there is a shaping that side and a shaping that side, and either on this side, on either side of my shaping I have a knit stitch. So I've got a shaped column of stitches, I've got a plain knit stitch, I've got another knit stitch, and then a shaping. So I want to go in the middle of those two to find out, to start off with. And I'm going to, so I need to go, that's my stitch, okay, that's right in the middle there. So I'm going, there we go, and I've got, have I got a stitch either side? I need to make sure that one, yeah, that's one, right, yeah, there we go, there I am now. Because it's very easy to just move a stitch over and get it wrong. And you might think, well, I know where my sides are, but it's so simple to get it wrong, and it's going to really affect your position of your heel. So all I'm doing is a piece of waste yarn. That's all I'm doing, and I'm going to go, I need to run down that. Let me just turn this side and get my hand in there so I can really see what I'm doing. I need to follow my line there and make sure I've, yeah, I'm still okay. Or have I gone one over there? Gosh, it's hard to see, isn't it? That's why we do it. Yeah, I'm still okay. So I need to, that's where I'm going. You can't just assume that you're getting it in the right spot. And you only need to go down as far as you're going to want your heel. So that side I'm going to snip off, and then I'm going to do the same to the other side. So I need to find 1, 2, there we go. And I would do it certainly in a contrasting yarn so that you can see it. There we go. I don't remember how far I went down, but it doesn't really matter at the minute. Okay, so there I have marked my sides of my sock. Okay, now remember I said that we want, it's usually half the amount, 50% of the amount of stitches on the needle. You can have, if you have a high instep or you're knitting for someone with a high instep, you might want to add a few more stitches on the foot side. You can, you know, increase that. You can increase the size of the heel, or you can reduce the size of the heel. But anyway, for our purposes, I've got 40 stitches, so I need 20. So I now need to find the right position for where my heel is going to be. So this is just my little sort of test piece. So I'm actually going to flip over this side because I've already decided I want it in this row. Okay. And I have got one of these sort of light bulb, what I call light bulb stitch markers, because they're shaped like a light bulb. You can just see it there. Something like that. You want a locking stitch marker, and this is so small, but it's really important. One thing I should say, that once you've decided, if you need to work out some calculations for where to place the heel, there's plenty of online references for calculating where the heel should go. There's plenty of books that have it too. One of my favorites is Vogue Ultimate Knitting Book, that has a whole section on measuring feet and measuring for socks, as do plenty of others. So it's fairly easy to find out how to measure and calculate where you want your heel. Anyway, once you have decided that, you're going to place a locking marker in the approximate place. I know that I want it here. I want it in the middle, but you wherever you want it, you want to put your marker in the row below where your first line is going to go. So that is it. That's where my marker is going to go. Now what we're going to do is pick up some stitches, and I'm going to pick up some stitches a bit like we did in the Afterthought heel, that we put in lifelines with waste yarn. You can use waste yarn to do this. You can use DPNs. You can use a circular or something flexible. I very much prefer something flexible because it gets a bit snug, and I usually use a needle that is smaller, a couple of sizes smaller than the needle that I've used to knit the sock. So I'm going to look for my V-shaped, and I'm going to go for the right leg of the knitted V. Okay, so our knitting, I'm looking at going from sort of cuff upwards. So this is the direction that I've knitted because I like to see the V's of my knitting. This is where my marker is, and I want to go the row above that, and I'm looking for the right leg of the V's. Okay, if I lift that a bit up, hopefully you can see that there. It'll make more sense as I go along. So in each one of the 20 stitches across here, I'm going to pick up that right hand leg. Okay, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to pull that through and hold that there. Okay, now I'm going to do exactly the same thing 2 rows below. So it's going to be 1 row below my stitch marker. Now this is easy on this because I've done 3 rows for my stripes, but you need to count that. You need to be careful that you're counting the right ones if you've got like a block of 5 or it's variegated. I made this easy for myself and for you to see because I've just done, stripes of 3 rows. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to pick up that right hand leg of my V shape, and I'm going to go along and do the same thing. And this is why you can see that it's worth using something flexible or a piece of waste yarn rather than a DPN. It gets very snug as you put this second line in, and again that's why it makes life a bit easier if you use a needle of a smaller size. Okay, working my way across. I got them all. Oh, I've got one extra, which I didn't want. There we go. Okay, so just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 20. Okay, so I have my circular needles or my waste yarn above and below that stitch marker. And this is where it gets a bit scary. And I would advise you before, because this is where we're going to start cutting our stitches. This is all very scary. The only other time that we are fine with cutting our knitting is when we're steeking. And once you've done the preparation, as we are here, whether for this or for steeking, there is something actually strangely satisfying about cutting into one's knitting, but only if we've done the prep and we know it's in the right place. So once you've done this, you're going to take a deep breath and start cutting. But before we do that, I want to make doubly sure that my stitch is just on that stitch, that is not caught up with anything else. And just to be extra sure, I'm just going to wiggle that round a bit, make sure I'm only cutting. In fact, I think I have caught the stitch below, which would not be good to cut that. So I'm going to take that out and just, there we go. Now I can put that back in, because if I cut the stitch below, that's my knitting. That's going to give me a problem. Right, so important to check. That's sort of standing on its own now. So I'm going to snip that. You need small, sharp scissors or sort of cutting tips to do that. And then we're going to, okay, here we go. No going back now. There we go. So now what I want to do is unpick that middle row along both sides. You're going to have to, if you've got a yarn that's a bit snaggy, or it sort of sticks to itself, it's going to take a while, and you will unpick. Whatever you do, don't cut these yarn tails. You're going to need them. So I'm not going to go along the whole one, and although that is coming out fairly well, but I'll switch to the other sample and you'll see then what we do next. So you're going to just ease that out. Don't try and speed it up. As I say, do it gently. So you're making your opening for your heel. But don't cut these off. Don't think, oh, it'll be speedier if I cut those off. You're going to need those later. They're actually really important. Okay. So for reasons of speed, I will just show you the next sample that I've done, or go back to this one. Now this one I have done the whole way across. Here are my yarn tails, which I will need what I'll do when my heel is done, I'll weave those in, and by doing that it'll also sort of snug up those sides that tend to get a bit gappy. For the time being, I want them safely out the way. I don't want to catch them out. I don't want them to get caught up with my knitting, and I certainly don't want to cut them off. So I mentioned that I'm doing the same heel as the toe for this one, so just bear with me. That's eventually going to end up there. I've also, so what I've done is I've put my stitches back onto the needles, the same needles that I worked the sock with. So they're the same size, and these are these flexi needles. Now whatever this is a sample, so my heel shape and my toe shape are probably going to be quite different to a full size sock pattern, but the principle is the same. This has been scaled down, but the principle is the same. What I did here is I knit one row in my contrast for my sock, then I did a decrease row. And whatever your pattern says, there's decrease rounds are usually followed by rounds without shaping, depending on the pattern. Sometimes they start off with just knitting a few rounds without any shaping and then go into the decreases. Knitting writer Stephanie Pearl McPhee came up with a 4-3-2-1 formula that works pretty well. And what that means is she did a decrease row, then she'd knit 4 rounds. She did another decrease row, then she'd knit 3 rounds. Another decrease row and 2 rounds, then a decrease row, and then it was decreases every 1 round. I modified that for this small sock sample, and what I did was essentially I did a decrease row, I did 3 rounds, I did a decrease 2 rounds, a decrease, then 1 round, and then I decreased to the top. So let me just show you the decrease as far as this goes. I'm not going to obviously knit the whole heel while you're sitting watching, but so I'm going to, there's no need to knot this, or again, I'm just going to tuck this in loosely. I just want to show you the when I'm doing the decreases. So what I'm going to do, I want my decreases to face inwards. I want them to go in the direction that the sock is shaping. So There are patterns I know that actually have the shaping towards the gap. That's just fine. But in this instance, we're going inwards. So I've done a knit one. Now I'm going to do an SSK, which is a left leaning decrease. I'm going to knit, and I'm using the flexi tips, and you'll see when I get to the end I want to keep that sort of snugged up, but as you can see I've got my stitches on 2 needles, and I'm knitting with the 3rd, and I really like that because I don't get too many interruptions. If I've got DPNs, I'm going to have 2 here in a short space of knitting. I do like this, but again, it's all down to your personal preference. So I'm just going to whiz along to the end of the row. So I did a knit one, I did an SSK, which is a left leaning decrease. I'm going to get to the last 3 stitches. I also like the fact that when you're doing a sock, that because you're working on 2 needles, you know exactly where your sides are. You haven't got to worry about stitch marker falling off or anything like that. Okie doke. So let's get to the last 3 on this side of my sock. Now I'm going to do a knit 2 together and a knit 1. Now I'm going to turn my sock round, and I'm going to work on this other side. Now, because I really don't want any more gaps than I have to have, and you know, I am going to snug that up eventually when I make my heel. I'm going to sort of snug this up when I start knitting again. So we did a knit 1, an SSK, I worked to the end, I did a knit 2 together, then a knit 1. I'm going to do exactly the same here. And what I do here is slide the stitches on the back needle sort of to the middle bit so that they don't pop off. So I'm going to really sort of snug that up. Knit 1, slip, slip, knit. That's my left leaning decrease. Then I'm going to carry on to the end of the row and do the right leaning decrease, which is the knit 2 together. And then I would do whatever my pattern said. You could of course do a different heel altogether. You could do a starburst heel like we did last week, but I'm just doing this in line with the toe because we didn't do that sort of heel last week. So here I'm at my last 3 stitches. On this side I'm going to knit 2 together, then knit 1. And of course at this point you can happily take those side markers out because you know where your sides are. So I would carry on working my heel until it's that sort of shape. And at that point I'm then going to have to, at some point, finish the heel. And I need to do a Kitchener stitch to get that nice rounded edge. Now, I love doing Kitchener stitch. I know people are fearful of it, but really it's a very nice stitch to do, and it's not that hard. Once you get going, it's really a nice sort of rhythmic thing. Now, in season 2, episode 6, I demoed in great detail Kitchener stitch with a setup row. Mostly you have a setup row. But one of the things that happens sometimes with Kitchener stitch that you certainly don't want on socks is that you get sort of little ears, little sort of square ends either side. So to avoid the ears, there's various ways of doing it, but the way I like the best and the easiest way is simply omit the setup row and go straight into the stitch pattern. And to do that, you will need, let's go the other side so I'm not tying myself up in my knitting yarn. To do that, you will need, I'm going back to this sample, don't worry about these bits here. In fact, I'm going to take those out because they're only going to get in the way now. So you'll need a tapestry needle or a yarn needle, whatever you like to call it. You need to have your stitches. I've got 8 on each side here. You need your stitches on 2 needles. I've put mine on DPNs. You can just as easily do it on a circular if you wish. I'm going to take these side bits out as well now because they're just going to get in my way. your length of yarn, you need approximately 3 times the length of your stitches. So I don't mean just on one side, I mean on both sides. Okay, 3 times the length of however many stitches you've got, approximately. I sometimes allow a little bit extra because I don't want to run out of thread while I'm doing my kitchen stitch. So your yarn is going to be from the back needle. It's essential that your yarn always goes under the needle tips. And here we go. So we're not doing a setup row, we're going straight into the stitch pattern. So our yarn needle goes through the first stitch on the front knitwise. I hope you can see that. Okay, let's move a few things out of the way. I hope you can, let me just lower this, hopefully, because I want you to be able to see this. Hopefully that's a bit better. Okay, so our yarn needle goes through the first stitch on the front needle knitwise. Pull that through and we drop that stitch off the needle. Okay, snug that up a little bit. Then it's going to go through to the next stitch on the front needle purlwise. Okay, but we pull the yarn through and we keep that on the needle. Now I'm going to go, my yarn needle is going to go through the first stitch on the back needle purlwise. Keep that yarn under the needles and I'm going to drop that stitch off the needle. Now I'm going to go through the next stitch on the back needle and I'm going to go through knitwise, but I'm going to leave that stitch on the needle and I've just unthreaded my needle. So I'm going to cut a bit off and thread it again. That's not supposed to happen. There we go. Oops. Right, now, so that's for the four stitch patterns there, and that's all I'm going to keep repeating. So if you missed it the first time, you've got plenty of time to see it again as we do this, because I am going to do all the 8 stitches here. So yarn needle goes through the first stitch on the front needle knitwise, and I drop the stitch off the needle. Then it goes, I snug it up a little bit, it goes through purlwise on the next stitch on the front needle, but I leave that on the needle. Now I'm going to go to the first stitch on the back needle, I'm going purlwise. I drop that stitch off the needle. Now it's knitwise through the next stitch on the back needle, and I leave that stitch on the needle. Essentially each stitch gets worked twice, apart from that very first one. Back again, so we've done those 4. Yarn needle through the first stitch on the front needle, and that goes knitwise, and my stitch is coming off the needle. Next stitch on the front is purlwise, and I keep it on the needle. Next stitch on the back needle, I'm going through purlwise, and I'm going to drop that stitch off the needle. Next stitch on the back needle, knitwise, and I keep it on. So in the end you get sort of a little mantra. I like to remember it as front knitwise, drop off. So we're going again, front knitwise, drop off, front purlwise, leave on, back purlwise, drop off, back knitwise, leave on. Front knitwise, drop off. Front purlwise, leave on. Back purlwise, drop off. And the reason I want to show you the whole thing is I want to show you what to do for the last couple of stitches. So that was our back purlwise, drop off. Now we need to back knitwise, leave on. At first it looks a bit of a mess, but you can see how lovely and rounded that toe is, or what would be the heel if we were doing it here. Okay, front knitwise. If you have to stop in the middle of doing your Kitchener stitch, make sure you stop after the 4th stitch pattern, after the 4th repeat, as it were, because it's much harder to remember where you were if you don't. So front knitwise, we're dropping this off. Front purlwise, leaving it on. Back purlwise. Oh, I've gone through I split that there, but not to worry. Back purlwise, drop off. Back knitwise, leave on. If I was doing that for a proper garment, I'd make sure that that hadn't, I'd go back and do that stitch, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it as is. So go down to the last few stitches. Front knitwise, drop off. Front purlwise, leave on. Back purlwise, drop off. And front knitwise, leave on. Now we're at our last 2 stitches. Normally in a Kitchener stitch we would just sort of fasten that off, but what we're going to do here is simply remove the needles. We're going to slip those out. The stitches aren't going anywhere, remember, because they've already had the yarn pass through them. So I'm going to snug them up a little, and then I'm going to show you what I do. I get my hand inside it, it's a lot easier. I want to pull it, I want to find you can either just go straight down there. My hand's in the way, I'm sorry. So here's my stitch where it's sort of coming out of that loop. You can either go straight down to the side of it, or you can go the other side of that loop, which I'm going to do, which is right there, and I'm going to pull it right through and pull that right down, and then I would just weave that in. You see how nice and smooth those edges are, lovely curvy toe or heel there, and no ears, which I think is magic. I wish I had invented that. I did not, but I think it's wonderful. And then you would just weave in your ends. So that is how you do Kitchener stitch without ears. I'm going to come back to full screen. So I do hope that you found this episode helpful, and that it's explained a few things about Afterthought heels. So feel free to message me if you have any questions at all about these heels, or any other questions related to knitting at all, because if you have a question about it, probably somebody else does. So this episode and all others are uploaded to our Knit Matters Facebook page and our YouTube channel of the same name. If you liked it, do let us know, and if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll instantly get any newly published videos straight away in your feed. If you're searching for this episode, it's season 4, episode 2. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, keep well, keep calm, and keep knitting. Bye for now.